the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Okay, let's break that down.
Yeah. So, I'm one of those people who's like, there's a reason this one is first. Because without the First Amendment, the others don't matter. But we'll get to why that's true in the last part of it. But the first part is respecting an establishment religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which very clearly is you don't have to be any religion. There is room in the Constitution in two places, in the document itself and in the Bill of Rights, there is room for atheism. And I am not an atheist, but I do think it's really important that people can be if that's what they are. And the Constitution leaves space for that. Not that pretty much any of the founding fathers were atheists by modern standards. The closest you get is deism, which is a whole other thing. That frankly, in many ways, tracks best with modern day paganism instead of atheism.
Yeah, the first part of this, no law, because they came from England. The Church of England was the law.
Yeah, Church of England was the law, and that gets into a whole bit. That ties back to the Protestant Reformation and Henry VIII, and there's a reason to the original purpose of having a state religion that there is a state religion in England.
Yeah,
but
and technically there was, I guess it wasn't really a state, I guess maybe it was a state religion, but Massachusetts was pretty strict about their religious people too.
Yeah, well, Massachusetts was founded as a religious colony.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on our Mayflower thing, the difference between the Puritans and the Pilgrims.
Yeah, and the thing is, Puritans versus separatists, but there was a whole thing where the Church of England was the official church. And in Massachusetts, they kind of carried that forward. And there were other states that were founded with specific state religions, and there were some that were founded with specific freedom of religion. And it was a patchwork up and down the colonies. But because the founding fathers came from up and down the colonies and, off the continent completely, you would get differing views. One of my favorite stories, I probably already told it before and I will probably tell it again, is the church where it was a Baptist congregation that encouraged its parishioners to vote for Jefferson over Adams because they thought that the atheist, as they saw him, would be better for their congregation than the Episcopalian. I forget what church Jefferson theoretically, nominally belonged to, but he was a deist. There was a Catholic who signed the Constitution. Just one, but there was one.
Was he from Maryland?
Yes. And as late as 1960, there were people who firmly believed that if John F. Kennedy became president, he'd be taking orders from the Pope. So religion is a complicated thing. There has never been a major candidate for the presidency who was not at least a nominal Christian. Whatever they believed inside, and I think Lincoln was an agnostic at best, and honestly, I think Obama would like to be an outspoken agnostic, but he can't be in public life in the United States. And of course, the incoming guy believes in himself, and that's it.
Well, some people think he is a religion.
Yes, well, But the closest we've gotten to a non-Christian candidate for presidency was we did have one Jew running for vice president. Joe Lieberman was the first non-Christian to run for the vice presidency, and I voted for him. That's not just living memory. That's in my adult lifetime.
That was my first election.
Yeah. And there had never been a non-Christian in that role before. At least, again, a non-official Christian, whatever their personal beliefs may have been.
And until 4 years ago, there was never a non-man in that role.
Well, no, the first woman to run for vice presidency of a major party was Geraldine Ferraro in 1984.
Well, run, yes, but
right. But the first woman to actually hold the office was Kamala Harris. But the fact is, despite the part where it's hard to get the job in practical terms if you're not a Christian, the Constitution doesn't say you have to be a Christian, and if anything, says the opposite. Very clearly, you don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be anything.
Yeah. That second part. The first one is they can't make a law about it. The second one is you can be whatever you want to be, to prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Yeah. In England at the time, and we are still saying England because the Articles of Unity, I don't believe, had passed yet. I don't remember exactly when that was, but
this was great. This was Great Britain. I think it wasn't United Kingdom yet, but it was Great Britain after 1707.
Okay, well, yeah, I don't remember a lot of those details. It's not my era, but in England, in Great Britain, whatever you want to call it, there was a state church, and you could be fined for not going to the state church, and you could be forbidden to set up your own church.
Well, fine would be the least of your problems, because...
Sure, I mean, if you were Quaker, you were probably going to get executed.
Or Catholic.
Yeah, Quakers, Catholics. But Catholic gets really, really complicated.
That's still a rule today. If you're a Catholic, you cannot be. You're out of the line of succession.
Yeah, apparently you can now marry a Catholic, so that's nice. But there were Catholics, and there were times when it was illegal to be a Catholic, and times when it wasn't. It was a whole big complicated thing. But Quakers literally got burned at the stake for a while. And there were times when Jews just got kicked out of the country, and Islam didn't come up much. But there were definitely laws prohibiting the free exercise of religion, and there was not a man among them who didn't belong to a religion that had been prohibited in English law at one point or another. And yeah, okay, for the Episcopalians, you had to go back a stretch to, Mary the First. But it's true that Protestants were burned at the stake under Mary the First. So they understood how that could get messy. And, the 30 Years' War was definitely a thing that had happened. It wasn't living memory because it happened during the Plymouth, colony. It was 1618 to 1648. but it was about religion.
At least at first.
At least at first. It got, I mean, any war in Europe quickly becomes about a lot more than the thing the war is nominally about. But it is certainly true that millions of people had died in Europe over the free exercise of religion. And it was very, very important. And this is one where I will say it was important to all of them. That didn't happen here. They didn't want religious war in the United States. And they felt, huh?
And that's the one thing we have never fought over, at least military, at least.
They were very firm that there would be no religious war in the United States, and that they would allow that the best way to prevent that was to allow people to express their religion in the way that made most sense to them.
I wish some people would realize that now in the present day.
Yeah. You cannot force people to believe what you want them to. Human minds just don't work that way. Even Elizabeth I, who did theoretically execute some people over religion, specifically said that she would make no windows into men's souls. That was not her business. It became her business when she was excommunicated and Catholics started trying to kill her, which, fair. But the founding fathers knew their English history. Again, this is pretty much a universal, that they all knew their English history. And if they weren't of English ancestry, they would know the history of the other European country they were from. And they knew that trying to enforce religion was a recipe for bloodshed.
So you're saying that this country wasn't founded on like Christian document ideas and stuff? I
believe it was John Adams who said that the United States was in no ways a Christian nation. Thomas Jefferson was the one who, in his writings, declared a wall of separation between church and state. And to be fair, neither of those guys were part of the Constitutional Convention, but they are two of our most revered founding fathers, and they were both very, very clear that separation of church and state was essential. There's a story about George Washington praying in a forest. Yeah, that was made up by the same guy who made up the cherry tree thing.
Oh. At least it's not as dumb as the guy that says George Washington was on the Mayflower and planted a flag in New York and called it the New Jerusalem, America.
Yeah, no.
Guy.
George Washington he was like a deacon or something. He did hold a minor office in his local church, but it's clear that was as much a social thing as anything else. And we know that he attended services that weren't just from that church. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he even attended a synagogue at least once. The modern view of the founding fathers as being these God-fearing men is completely ahistorical. Another of my favorite stories is the fact that Thomas Jefferson published a Bible with what he called, and this is a direct quote, the obvious exaggerations of Jesus's biographers left out of it. And one of the things left out of Jefferson's Bible is the resurrection. Thomas Jefferson did not believe in the resurrection. That is not a Christian by modern evangelical views.
So he was mainly, I guess he was, he's probably mainly a Mark guy then.
Thomas Jefferson officially was a deist, which is a religion that, again, we don't really have anymore. Now that it's okay to just not be Christian. um, but it's a rationalistic theology.
Yeah,
Which,
I think from what I've told before, it's God started everything, and then this whatever,
yeah,
I think started the spark, and like, okay, you're on your own path, you're on your own universe.
yeah, it is all about like natural theology, like how you can see God through nature. It's very much entrenched in Enlightenment thinking. I think the closest to religions we have these days, though there are some people who consider themselves deist, I think by and large what you have is Unitarians and neo-pagans are much, much closer to deists than most other religions. My father's father, was a Methodist minister, and he hated Unitarians. He used to say they believed in one God at the most. And that is true. That is deism in a nutshell. One God at the most. One God or all God. So Thomas Jefferson wouldn't have wanted a system where he was forced to go to a church, because he didn't really believe what any of the churches in his day believed. None of the founding fathers would have wanted any of the others to be in control of what religion they were allowed to be, because they mostly didn't discuss religion, but if they had, and when they did, there were bitter arguments over how various people saw God. Freedom of religion was vitally important to them because they knew, in a more visceral level than modern Americans do for the most part, except for some refugees, they knew what it was like to be persecuted for their faith. It hadn't happened to them, but most of them could probably have told you an ancestor that it happened to. And let's face it, the laws of the Plymouth colony were incredibly repressive about religion. And they didn't want that either. I don't think people realize exactly the religious conflict that led to freedom of religion being in the Constitution in the first place. The history of of New England is written in religious conflict. And there are two whole states that exist outside of New England so that people who aren't Church of England could have a place to go and be safe.
I think that was Connecticut and Rhode Island.
Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Oh, I thought. Okay, so I thought you were like
Rhode Island, yes, but literally the reason for the existence of Pennsylvania is a place where Quakers aren't going to get executed. So this is two of the big states. Let's be clear.
Yeah. But yeah, Maryland was for Catholics, I think.
Maryland was for Catholics, and Pennsylvania was for Quakers.
Yeah, the other two I was talking before, they're the breakaways from Massachusetts.
Yeah,
they left off.
Yeah, and that's an interesting story, and I cannot recommend enough. Sarah Vowell's The Wordy Shipmates gets a lot into the religious aspects of Plymouth Colony and Connecticut and Rhode Island and all of that. It's a really, really fun read. She's an entertaining writer who also is the voice of Violet from the Incredibles movies. But, all of these men would have known this part of the country's history in a way that most modern Americans do not, and would have known how vitally important freedom of religion is. And I am not saying this as a member of a minority religion here. I'm saying this as a historian. Freedom of religion is essential. Because without freedom of religion, what you get is sectarianism and bloodshed. That is just true, historically speaking. Also, when people say they don't want freedom of religion, they always think their religion is going to be the one in charge. And another thing that history has showed us is that you can't be certain of that. If you look at England, it went back and forth between Catholic and Protestant for quite some time. And people who would have been perfectly fine under one monarch were suddenly oppressed under the next one.
Or at the height of who they are.
Yeah. Yeah. People would go to churches they didn't believe in because it was better than the alternative. And while some people may see that as desirable, they only see that as desirable when the church people are being forced to go to is theirs. Which is, again, something you can't guarantee, because you can't guarantee that all people in charge will hold the same religious view as you do. So that's religion pretty well explained.
Next, abridging the freedom of speech.
Now, this is not freedom without consequences, which is why we have things like libel and slander laws, and defamation of character laws, and inciting a riot, and things like that. There are ways where you can be punished for your speech if your speech is, let us say, irresponsible. You, the citizen, have the responsibility to make sure that what you say is true and will not unnecessarily cause, it's the old, you cannot falsely shout fire in a crowded theater position. Because what you're doing then is just causing a disturbance for the sake of causing a disturbance that can cause serious harm to other people. That's not acceptable. We do have laws against that. Another one that people don't get is that the First Amendment only applies to the government. It doesn't apply to your social media company. They're allowed to limit your speech. They're a private company. Sometimes it's silly, like a lot of the regulations on YouTube about what you can and cannot say. Some of the euphemisms that people have developed to get around the YouTube regulations just get silly given some of the topics being discussed on YouTube. I watch a true crime podcast that has to censor itself because there are certain words that will get it demonetized, despite the fact that it's true crime. The genre is allowed. Certain words within the genre are not. But YouTube has the absolute right to do that because they are a private entity. You're not allowed to just go around and say whatever you want about whoever you want with absolutely no consequences. Now, apparently, the idea of speech that no one would actually believe, exaggerated insults, have at the Constitution says you can do that. John Oliver made a whole musical number about that.
And people might not like it, and sometimes I don't like it either. But this even includes, unfortunately, hate speech.
Yeah, hate speech is constitutionally protected in the United States, and that is another one that is very different from a lot of other countries. But in the United States, you have the legal right to use, for example, ethnic slurs. Now, you are also going to suffer consequences for doing that. The Constitution does not protect you from the consequences of your own actions. Sorry, kids. But also, it is possible for you to be considered inciting a riot or similar laws if you use your speech to attempt to create action. So it is one thing to say, I hate all of such and such a group of people. But it is another thing to give a speech in front of a group of other people and say, we now need to go kill all of the people from such and such group.
Or like saying, let's go march down to the Capitol and stop them from doing stuff.
Yeah. You're that sedition is illegal, which is advocating for the overthrow of the government. It turns out people should have been prosecuted for that. But they weren't, so here we all are. Yeah.
Right.
Shouldn't have taken 4 years to prosecute. Hills I will die on. But as long as your speech is not along those lines, and the regulations on what exactly you have to say and where you're saying it before it's considered to be defamation of character or what have you are going to vary. I, as a private citizen, can get away with a lot more than, a newscaster or a comedian on a late night TV show. The jokes I can make are very, very different than the jokes that Stephen Colbert can make because he has a much larger platform than I do. Even on YouTube, we are not going to get anywhere the reach of Stephen Colbert's videos.
Yeah, I think he had. I think he had more. I'll say more reach, but he had more freedom of what he could say when he was on Comedy Central compared to.
Yeah, I would say probably true. But conversely, you can say less about me than you can say about Stephen Colbert because he is a public figure and I am not. As a private figure, if, random celebrity suddenly decided they came across these videos, for example, and decided they didn't like what I was saying, I would have more protection than they would about what I would conversely say about them, simply because freaking nobody's heard of me. So I have a much larger, here it comes again, right to privacy than, say, Elon Musk does.
Of course, once we upload these, they come public, you're going to be the most famous person ever in history.
Yes, it's true, actually. But the protections from other people's freedom of speech have historically been as limited as we can make them. Speech is more important. And sometimes we sway too far one way, and sometimes we sway too far another way, and there's no shining line. There is no place where you can say, this is the perfect balance between protection and freedom of speech. But we keep trying to find it. But by and large, you're allowed to say whatever you want. You're gonna suffer consequences. Probably. Maybe. But, I can say, in theory, which I won't, but I could, that I don't like a specific group of people. And I have that constitutional right. Nobody is required to provide me a platform. But I could go in my front yard and just start yelling, my neighbors would think it was weird, but I could go in my front yard and start yelling whatever I wanted. Especially because it's almost 10 in the morning my time as we record this, and it's not like I have to worry about a noise ordinance.
Yeah. I can say it. I am bigoted against bigots.
Yes. Yeah. But that includes, historically speaking, the right to say, I don't like such and such elected official. It's infuriating to me that a lot of the people who want to limit the right of their opponents to insult the incoming administration are the ones who've been wearing, Let's Go Brandon merchandise.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Exactly. Like, all of these are very much, the people who are trying to limit these see themselves as being in control. And they do not realize that the same law that would prevent me from saying, I find Trump fully insufferable, incompetent, and senile, would also have limited their Let's Go Brandon merchandise. It's a balance. Both sides have this right, and it's not going to be good for you if it goes away, because you're not always going to be in control. They think that they will always be in control, and therefore it will always be protecting them. And what the Founding Fathers knew was that it doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it comes back to bite you. And again, this is one of those rare universals. They all knew how history changes, and how the person in control now is not necessarily going to be the person in control next year.
All right. Okay. And then we go from the speech of one person to technically the speech of a company, otherwise known as the press.
Yeah. And this is one that the incoming administration is actively talking about violating. They want to take away freedom of the press. This is not, I'm inferring this. They are saying it with their whole chests. And it's already having an effect of limiting what various companies are saying because they are afraid of prosecution. And one of the problems with that is that it limits what information you, as a member of the public, will receive, because they're afraid to report these stories. What? Sorry, my kitten wants in.
Okay.
So they're afraid to report on anything that puts the incoming administration in a bad light, because they're afraid of lawsuits. And, he's actually called for the arrest of people like Stephen Colbert and John Oliver by name. And they have First Amendment protection. They are members of the press. They are allowed to report on what they see and express their feelings about it. Now, again, they are more constrained because of how big their reach is. But nothing that they are saying violates that. What they're being threatened with is, you are not allowed to say you don't like what the administration is doing. You are not allowed to say this person in the administration is incompetent. You are not allowed to question the mental capacity and mental acuity of the president.
Or even apparently joke about the president.
Yeah. And that is, if you're not worried about that, why aren't you worried about that? That is, again, should not be a partisan issue. you should be afraid of laws that would prevent people in power from criticizing other people in power. Because if the people in power can't do it, you sure can't. The whole point of journalism is to call out the government when it's screwing up. That is one of its most important functions. And the incoming administration wants to limit that. And yeah, okay, in doing so, Trump wants to call on the 1803 Alien and Sedition Acts, also known as one of the worst laws ever passed in U.S. history. Like, it's fully acknowledged that they are terrible laws. And that is not a partisan issue. Like, you get, oh, sorry, we've spotted the birds in the tree. You get people from both major parties saying this is a terrible law that never should have been passed. It's one of the worst moments in U.S. history outside of things like the Civil War. Almost everyone agreed on that until about 3 months ago. So, we're attempting to go back to a major abuse of power that violates the First Amendment, wherein simply criticizing the government is considered sedition. And that is not what, that is not what sedition is. Because if you watched the late night comedians, and I don't watch all of them because I don't find some of them very funny, but if you watch them, they're never saying, ergo, we should overthrow the government. They are saying, ergo, you should vote in a certain way.
Yeah.
Which they are fully entitled to do.
I can see it now. Today on ABC News. Hello, the president is great. He has done nothing wrong. All hail the president. Now for weather.
Yeah. Folks, our president is not Hypnotoad. You're allowed to not say all hail. So, the fact that freedom of the press was enshrined in the First Amendment should tell you how important it was seen as being. Without freedom of the press, we do not have a functioning democracy. And yes, I'm aware that that's kind of the point. Well, from the perspective of a lot of these people, they don't want a functioning democracy. They want an oligarchy that only lets their side in. I know that. What I'm doing is trying to explain to other people why they should care. If you care about the proper function of your government, you should care about threats to imprison John Oliver. Frankly, I'm willing to bet they try to deport him even though he's a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, he got like a few years ago, I think, what, 5-6 years ago, he became a citizen.
Yeah. He is married to a U.S. citizen. Actually, the woman he's married to, when he still worked for The Daily Show, they were covering the Republican National Convention, but the RNC wouldn't give them press credentials. So they were doing guerrilla coverage of the RNC. So they spent a lot of their time at the convention hiding. And John Oliver's wife is a U.S. veteran who was there as part of a group that was trying to get the Republicans to treat veterans better. Spoiler, that has not worked. And she hid John Oliver and a Daily Show crew in her hotel room at the RNC. That's how they met.
Neat.
Isn't that fantastic? There are some great stories in the oral history of The Daily Show. So freedom of the press is vital, and there's a reason it's in the First Amendment.
Next,
and the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Now, peaceably is a big word here. And in practice, what this can mean is that you have to get a permit to hold your assembly. They don't.
I thought it just meant you don't go breaking windows and stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, that is one of the issues, is don't go breaking windows. But also, the Supreme Court has held that this can include you have to get a permit and file your plans with the local police department so they know where you are. And, for example, can route emergency vehicles around you. Here in Olympia, I don't think they do it anymore, but there used to be an annual May Day protest. And as part of the May Day protest, they refused to file for a permit and refused to tell the police department where they were going to march. Because they felt that was antithetical to the spirit of May Day, which, okay, I can get that.
So, were they protesting May 1st? Is that May Day?
Well, May Day is International Workers' Day.
Okay.
It was always celebrated in the Soviet Union with enormous parades of tanks and things. And so it is a day that is supposed to be the real Labor Day, basically, is celebrating the workers and the sacrifices they've made and petitioning for more equitable treatment. All of this I can approve of, except, the Soviet parades of tanks and things. However, the May Day protest in Olympia was held on the west side of Olympia, within a mile of Capital Medical Center, which is one of the 2 hospitals in the Olympia-Lacey-Tumwater area. Which means you get a lot of ambulances in that part of town. And the protesters would not say where they were going to be marching. So they couldn't reroute ambulances around it until things were already going. And I don't know if anyone died from that, but it's possible that someone could have. And that always used to really bother me, because they were very vocal about not caring. And that's not... I have no problem with your protest blocking streets, provided emergency vehicles know how to get around you. Blocking streets is a historic form of protest. Whenever people complained about it during, for example, the BLM protests, I would post the same picture of the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the March on Selma. Like, that is a thing we do in this country. We block streets with our protests. But it's reasonable for you to have to tell the ambulances how to get around you. Now, it's been held that the police are not allowed to withhold a permit based on what your protest is about. Which, yes, means that they're forced to give protests to white supremacist groups. And we can have all the problems with that we want.
This goes back to the freedom of speech thing.
It does. You are legally allowed to be a white supremacist. It means you're a terrible person, but you can do it. But everyone in this country has the right to peaceably assemble. You are not allowed to, I don't know, break into buildings and put government officials at fear of their lives, for example. That's not peaceably assembling.
I think I mentioned it before, but going back to BML protest, just the one that was peacefully assembled is the one that got tear gassed for a Bible photo
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. And during the BLM protests, I had certain of my, let's say, older Facebook friends saying things like, well, but they're rioting, blah, blah. And the thing is no. Most of the BLM protests were peaceful until the cops showed up. The cops were not being peaceful. But the people protesting had a constitutional right to do so. They believed they had a grievance. We'll get to that in a minute. And they wanted to make their grievance public. And that meant that they were allowed to be in a large group on the streets. Now, in the UK, in 1714, they passed what was called the Riot Act. The Riot Act is a literal thing. And it prohibited any group of 12 or more people who were, quote, unlawfully, riotously, and tumultuously assembled together from gathering. The thing is whose version of unlawful, riotous, and tumultuous, but the an officer had to read out loud an actual phrasing. So if you've ever heard reading the Riot Act, literally, they had to read the whole thing. Our sovereign lord the king chargeth and commandeth all persons being assembled immediately to disperse themselves and peaceably to depart to their habitations or to their lawful business upon the pains contained in the act made in the first year of King George for preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. God save the king. And then you had an hour. And if you didn't disperse within an hour, you could be executed without benefit of clergy.
Benefit of clergy?
You weren't allowed to have, you weren't allowed to say, well, but I'm a clergyman, and therefore I have to go to an ecclesiastical court. In practice, that was a fun law because all it took was memorizing a certain amount of Latin, and you could declare yourself to be clergy. It was really fun. But you could be executed for assembly. And that was the law at the time in the UK. And sure, it does include the words, tumultuously and riotously, but if the act was read, it didn't matter what you were doing. And so that act is unconstitutional under the First Amendment because it's some hot garbage.
Yeah, looking back in hindsight, I mean the BLM thing was already high enough. I wonder if it was even more emotional tensions because at the same time, we're the BLM protests. Were we doing something called something like a lockdown?
Yeah, no, and there's a reason I didn't go to any of our local BLM protests. I mean, there's a bunch. I was, parenting 2 small children and am physically disabled.
I think the two of them combined together, the lockdown stress pandemic and plus the BLM,
BLM, yeah.
Together was
Yeah, and I explained the whole thing to my son, who was 7 at the time, because I thought it was important for him to know what was happening. And I'm here to tell you he had a really hard time understanding why anybody would dislike someone for the color of their skin. So, you know.
And but I do believe it was only the BLM protesters that were still wearing their masks. Other people were.
Yeah, the BLM protesters wore masks at their protests. I know I have pictures of friends at these protests. You know,
So they weren't anti-maskers.
They were not anti-maskers. The feeling was that if police officers could break into your home while you were asleep and shoot you, that was kind of something that they needed to protest, and it didn't matter if they were risking illness for it. Because if the police could break into your home and shoot you for no reason, that's at least as dangerous as a disease. And no, legit. That's perfectly fair.
And finally,
To petition the government for a redress of grievances. You have the right to complain to your government. You have the right to say, hey, this isn't working for me. We need to fix this thing. And it doesn't have to be petition in the way that modern people think about it, where it's all signatures and things. These protests are petitioning the government. They are trying to capture the attention of the government in a way that, I'm going to be real here, a list of signatures is not going to do. You know, protesting and filling a bridge with people marching to say, hey, we'd like to be allowed to vote now, gets a lot more attention than a list of signatures by people who aren't even registered to vote. I can't imagine why they're not. And in the modern media environment, it gets the attention of people outside the government too, and gets them to maybe be on your side. The civil rights movement really took off because of television, because people outside the South were seeing, you know, fire hoses and police dogs being turned on literal children who just wanted to be able to go to school. So, petitioning your government is not just, it's certainly not signing a change.org petition, which I'm sorry, people, does not actually do much of anything. It can be holding a protest, holding a rally, holding a march. You know, I went to a march years ago. I don't even remember what it was for now. Where we were in my state capitol building marching around. And that is constitutional. Now, I will not say it was 100% peaceable in as much as it was in fact very loud, but it was peaceable in the sense that nobody got hurt. You know, and I'm pretty sure the correct paperwork had been signed. There's a whole system at the state capitol. But legally, we were within our rights to go to the state capitol building and say, hey, you know, this thing that you're doing, I'm not on board. We need to be doing this other thing instead. And the laws about marching inside the US Capitol are a lot stricter for a lot of reasons. But there are whole spaces outside that have historically been considered, this is where you go and have your rally. And provided you know, keep it to that sort of thing and not breaking windows and threatening congresspeople and stealing podiums, podia, technically that would be, you're fine. You're within your legal rights.
Do you remember the rally that Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert had like 10, 15 years ago?
The rally to restore
Sandy and or Fear?
Yeah, Fear and or Sanity, I believe it was. Yeah, no, I watched part of that.
I think I have it on tape somewhere because I had it on VHS recorded.
Yeah. I might have a friend or two who was actually there.
By the way, for those who don't know what that is, a VHS is a tape that people used to play stuff, record stuff on.
It's a manner of storing video on magnetic tape and then playing it back. Yeah, we found a VCR in my stuff recently, and the kids were like, "What is this?" We're like, oh, okay. But yeah, the rally was within its legal rights, and they had to get a permit, especially because that was a really freaking big rally. But also, picketing in front of the White House or in front of Congress, if you're on your own, you legally get to do that. He's a bad example because he eventually tried to hijack an airplane and have it fly into the White House. But there was a man named Ari Bremer, I believe, who I believe he's one of those people who is not a well man, but he no, it wasn't Arthur Bremer. Gosh, who was it? And I should know this because it's Samuel Bick. Samuel Bick. I should know this because it's in the musical Assassins. But he petitioned in front of the White House wearing a Santa suit with a sign that said, "All I want for Christmas is my constitutional rights." And that's perfectly legal. Trying to hijack a plane and fly it into the White House, less so. Which is why I was so confused when people said that no one could imagine what happened on 9/11, because clearly Samuel Bick could imagine it. In freaking, 1974. He was killed in his attempt.
So was that Nixon or
that was Nixon?
I know it was Ford. Ford was already out by the. Was Ford yet? Or
this was February of 74. And he believed, and I can't imagine what evidence he would have had for it, that the Nixon administration was conspiring to oppress the poor. Can't imagine where he would have gotten that idea. But his protest was completely legal. Up to the point where it wasn't, obviously. But a single man picketing in front of the White House, no matter how he's dressed and no matter what his signs. I mean, I think you have to be dressed in as much as I'm pretty sure there's public decency laws involved. But if you pass those, doesn't matter what you're wearing, and it doesn't matter what your sign says, you have that legal right under the Constitution. You have a right to protest. You have a right to assemble. You have a right to tell your government that you don't like how they're acting. Now, you note that the government doesn't have to listen to you. And that is in some ways a good thing, because, oh boy, has the government heard some bonkers things that people want them to do. See also January 6th.
Yes. Now, we might bring up some court cases when we talk about these, and I might be misremembering, but the one they might change later, the Madison Mayberry court case. I believe, if I remember correctly, for a long time, that one said this stuff only applies to the federal government. The state government doesn't count.
Yes. It took until, I believe, the passing of the 14th Amendment before this applied to the state governments. So there could be state religions, for example. And the state could abridge your freedom of speech or of the press. That is no longer the case, and in fact, it's generally considered to be true on a local level as well. I don't think that's expressly the case, but it's just generally considered no government now can do these things within the United States. But yeah, for a long time, the word Congress at the beginning of this was taken very, very literally. This was a congressional law. Nowadays, it's no government is going to do this in the US, which is why, for example, any school district attempting to teach creation science or intelligent design gets shot down, because that is establishment of religion. Because I'm sorry, young earth creationists, but creationism only makes sense if you are of your specific religion, and to people who are not, you've never been able to prove it. Once you can show your work, you can teach it in a science class.
Yeah, because like I said, the religion thing is not only that religion, but your interpretation of that religion.
Exactly. It's not just Christians, it's this specific sect of Christians. Students are generally considered to have these rights. The saying there is, they do not leave their rights at the schoolroom door. So students are allowed a certain right of protest and a certain freedom of school newspapers. And you can't, for example, make Jehovah's Witnesses say the Pledge of Allegiance. Nobody can be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They are allowed to not do that as part of a religious or personal objection.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was either my junior or senior year, I saw some guys sitting down, like, you can do that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've taught my kids that already. Like, you don't have to say the pledge. If I'm in school at the time at which the pledge is said, I don't say it. I don't stand, I don't put my hand on my heart. I have real problems with the Pledge of Allegiance. My biggest problem, honestly, is that my kids don't know what it means. So every day they're being expected to recite something they don't understand.
It wasn't until years later, after I graduated, I actually broke down in my head. It's like, we're pledging allegiance to a flag, not even to the United States, but to a flag.
Yep.
I did not, when I was doing that as an automatic thing, I did not realize that at the time. So it's just the emotions.
So, children are considered to have these rights as well. You cannot force school prayer.
But that also means opposite of that. Doesn't mean kids can't pray. This can be forced to pray. Because people are like, let's bring prayer back to school. I'm like, prayer never left school. I mean, I prayed in school.
There was a Christian club, an official organized Christian club at my high school in the 90s. I mean, it only had like 6 members, but it was there. You could join if you wanted to. And another one of my favorite things is I still have it. He died a few years ago, sadly, but I have in my possession a Christmas card that I was given my sophomore year in high school from my friend Jesus.
I even did the 1 year that prayer around the pole thing.
Oh yeah, no, I think a couple of people tried doing that at my school, but no one much cared, so it didn't go very long.
I did it twice the 1 year. I did it once at my high school and then once at my JVS school because we went there in high school. We did that in the early morning. Then we rode my bus to JVS and then I did it there too. So I did it twice.
Yeah, I think I saw some people doing that. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Okay, whatever. And your kid can take days off school for religious holidays. If your school is in session, the most well-known example is if your school is in session on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, your kid can get excused from school for those. This year, the winter solstice fell on Saturday, and my kids had school literally the day before. But I told them very clearly, like, look, if you guys ever have school scheduled for the winter solstice, I'm pulling you out of that school for that day as our winter holiday. It's a religious holiday to me, and you will be home for Yule. That's just what's going to happen. Kids can be kept home from school they have to go to mass on holy days of obligation. You can be late to school on Ash Wednesday, and you can go through school with the ashes on your forehead for Ash Wednesday. I always joke that I can tell when Colbert went to mass before filming because he's always still got the ash on his forehead. I used to refer to it as schmutz, which amused my friend enormously because that's a Yiddish word that I was using to refer to a Catholic ritual. Yiddish, not pre-Yiddish. There are a lot of little bits of the First Amendment that we don't even notice are the First Amendment in our day-to-day lives. You can choose whether to say God bless you or Gesundheit or Salud or whatever when someone sneezes, or, be rude and say nothing. Nobody can force you to perform that little ritual. Every day, you rely on your First Amendment protections, no matter what you're doing.
Like the freedom to make this video that we're making.
Like the freedom to make this video that we're making. Like the freedom to say whatever you want within reason to your friends. You can't try to get a bunch of your friends together to go on down to the Capitol building and break in, but as long as you're doing stuff below that level, you can say whatever you want. You have these rights.
I know it's a true saying, but what's that saying about your fist and my face thing?
Yeah, Oliver Wendell Holmes, my right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins. And that is actually Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Talking about the limitations on the First Amendment. You're not allowed to hurt other people. You can't just say, oh, I'm swinging my arms around, and if people are in my way, that's their problem. No, that's your problem. You need to be aware of where your arms are going. But if you're standing in an empty field swinging your arms around, you have the absolute right to stand in that empty field and swing your arms around. I am alone in my room right now. Only living creatures in here other than me are the cats. And maybe a spider or two. And I can swing my arms freely because I'm not going to hit anybody as long as I'm, careful of the cats.
Cats take you to court.
They're right to say meow to their government. But the limitations on the First Amendment have always been seen to be where it infringes on other people's rights. Defamation is infringing on other people's right to not be defamed. Sedition is infringing on other people's right to have their government in place. Inciting a riot is an infringement on other people's right to not be around a riot.
Anything else you want to talk about here? Or you think we've
I think we've been going at this one for a while. I think we're good. I could go on. The First Amendment is my favorite amendment. Because I have a favorite amendment because I'm that kind of person.
Whenever I upload this to YouTube eventually, hopefully soon, you can always add more in the comment section.
Yeah. But I think we've covered the important stuff.
And we've gone 30 minutes longer than we did the first time around for this amendment.
Well, to be fair, we don't have to worry about a deadline on this one where, we have to stop talking at some point.
Next, we will talk about another controversial amendment for.
Oh, yeah.